This recording was produced by the Savanna Institute and funded by a grant from the USDA SARE program. You'll be hearing a conversation between aspiring silvopasturist Jared Dressman and silvopasture expert Cherrie Nolden, who grazes in the driftless area of southwestern Wisconsin. You can find more silvopasture resources at savannainstitute.org.
My name is Jared Dressman, and I'm interviewing Cherrie Nolden, a PhD candidate for animal sciences at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And so I guess I'd like to start by, if you wouldn't mind, maybe talking a little bit about your farm, if you're currently farming. I know in the email you had sent, you had just purchased 80 acres, I believe, and then if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about some of the research that you've done at University of Wisconsin.
Sure. Yeah, so currently we have 130 acres, and it's a mix of pasture and woodland with the farmstead buildings and smaller kind of paddocks up around the buildings. But we do rotational grazing, or I guess the more current term would be a holistic managed grazing, because we don't rotate the animals based on a set time. It's all based on the vegetation that's available at the time that we're rotating whatever class and species of livestock through, and what they need from a nutritional standpoint based on what's out there with the forage availability. So we do have a small sort of silvopasture area that we've been working on over the last 3 years to thin to a level that we can actually get light to the ground. That's a locust grove, and so the clonal aspect of that continues to grow back quite vigorously. But since we rotationally graze goats, they really enjoy girdling the new shoots and eating the leaves off. So we have been fairly successful in getting a higher amount of forb and herbaceous species in our understory, and thinning out the canopy such that the light gets down there that can provide those plants with the light that they need at that level, instead of it being just a bare dirt and leaves and twigs and a few brambles in the understory, which is what it was when we first bought it. And then recently, yes, we've purchased 80 acres of forest land that is a primarily oak woodland with very woodland style or form of trees, in terms of it being very thin and tall and upright, and not the open grown form that you would normally see in an oak savanna, or more of a silvopasture type system. And so our plan with that is to reduce the canopy through logging to between 10 and 20% cover, use those trees to provide shade and mast, and then also a source of regeneration for the tree species for the next generation, and let enough light down to the ground that we have some decent biomass growing on the ground layer for primarily for feeding goats in the first 3 to 5 years, and then following that, as the plant community shifts from more of a shrub and pioneer species community to a more established forb-based and herbaceous species type community, then we can bring in more cattle and sheep and horses into that system, and move the goats on to another area that will have more brush invasion, and they can again work at removing the brush from the system and allowing the forbs to grow and push that community back toward more of an oak savanna type system. And this is all stuff that I've done as part of my master's degree at UW-Madison in agroecology, looking at the impacts of using goats for woody invasive control in an oak savanna restoration, and then also just my personal experience and work with my own goat herd at various properties in Kansas and in Wisconsin. I did some work at the Badger Army Ammunition Plant in Sauk City, Wisconsin, and down at our farm in central Kansas, and just looking at how the goats behave and their forage preferences, and then thinking about how to apply that to achieve our vegetation management objectives and forage production objectives in the same location, and based on what the seasons provide us in terms of precipitation, what our soils are like, what plants naturally grow there and are likely to grow there in the future if we provide a certain disturbance at a certain time of year. And so it's all, there's a lot of things that are considered when applying the animals at a certain time or for a certain duration, and with a goal in mind for both the animal production aspects and the vegetation community management aspects.
Okay. So with the planned rotation grazing, are you looking at like a certain amount of pounds per acre, or is that not really considered? Is it?
It's so. Do you mean pounds of animals per acre? Is that what you're?
Yeah.
We don't.
Yeah.
I haven't actually sat down and calculated what our instantaneous pounds per acre happens to be. We're frequently grazing or browsing. I would say between. It just depends on the site, but this past year it was around 200 head of goats on maybe 2 to 3 acres for about 2 to 3 days during the peak of summer growth. And during the spring, when plants are growing like crazy, it can be longer. And during the fall, when the plants are senescing, that same group of animals will spend less time on the same size acre, same size plot or same size paddock, just because there isn't the vegetation there to support them. So it changes throughout the season, and it changes by soil type. In the better soil types, you'll have a greater forage density, so that same pounds of animal can stay in that location longer and be fed well. Whereas if the soil is thinner or it's more eroded, like a rocky slope, which is a good place for goats to be browsed because they can take advantage of that better than other species of livestock, they're not going to spend as much time there. And often we aren't changing our group size. The animal group stays the same throughout the grazing season or browsing season. What we do change is the size of the paddock and the time that they're in that location. And so for each paddock, we'd have to calculate what the pounds of animal per acre is at that time of the year in that particular location. And each paddock would be a little bit different as we move through the rotation throughout the year.
Okay. And then are you using electric netting? And if so, like, how tall is your netting that you're using? And also I was wondering how many volts do you keep on the fence?
So we use the Premier 1 netting, and we use their sheep netting, which is 35 inches tall, and each net is 164 inches or 164 feet long. And our goal is ideally to have the fence above 1.5 kilovolts. If it's below 1.5 kilovolts, trained goats will start pushing their way through it. For training goats, for getting them to respect the electric netting fence, having between 2.5 to 4 kilovolts is what is required to get them to respect it. It's better to have it more at like 7,000 volts or 7 kilovolts for doing the training, just to get them to respect it very quickly. But then once they've been trained to the fence and you keep it hot, having at least 1.5 is minimum. And ideal would be around 2.5 kilovolts year-round to maintain their respect of that fence. And when we're browsing, we're pushing them to consume 100% of the woody vegetation between 6 inches from the ground up to 7 feet above the ground. And so we're pushing them to eat more than what a person would do if they were just trying to sustainably harvest the forage in that area. If we didn't want to cause injury to the brush, we would only remove around 1/3 of the brush at any one time. But we're trying to remove 100% or defoliate 100% of the brush that the goats can reach when we're applying the goats for invasive woody species management or control. And so in that sense, we need our fences to be hot enough that the animals respect it, but we also have to be responsive to the animals' needs. So we have to know when they're going to be out of food and be prepared to move them to the next paddock before they get hungry, before they're far enough out of food that they're going to start testing the fence. And there will be some goats every year that will learn to test fences and jump fences, and from a management perspective, those goats need to get removed from the herd. Otherwise, they will teach all the other goats to do the same thing. They learn a lot from each other.
Okay. And so you had mentioned depending on the forage and the time of year, is kind of depends on how many days they go before being rotated again. It sounds like around 2 to 3 days. I was just wondering, with that rotation, do you still see any problems with parasites, or do you pretty much not see any parasite problems?
No, we definitely see parasites, and when we're using goats for brush control, our goal is to re-browse that same site or that same physical paddock in that landscape at least twice during any one growing season, because that will knock the brush back most effectively. And it takes more than 6 months for the parasites that affect goats to be extinguished from the landscape if the conditions are right, if the humidity is decent, if it's not too dry. Parasites will die if it's very dry, if the site dries out significantly, or if hay is harvested off of a site, but rarely are we browsing goats in a place where hay can be harvested. It's not flat enough, it's not free enough of woody vegetation for that. And parasites will overwinter. So as we browse a site from year to year, by the time we get to the 3rd year, we have quite an accumulation of parasites on that site. And so from a parasite management perspective, the very best approach to managing parasites within any herd is to select for individual goats that are genetically resistant to parasites. We can use chemical dewormers for a short period of time, but the parasites very quickly outwit us because they can change and become resistant to the chemical dewormers that we have. And there's evidence of that all around the country. Every herd has a different level of parasites with resistance to the various chemical dewormers that have been used recently in that herd. And by rotating through dewormers like has been suggested in the past, we just create resistant worms. So the best way to do management of parasites in a species like goats that tend to be very susceptible to parasites is to breed and select individual goats that are naturally resistant to those parasites, so they can tolerate a load or an exposure, high exposure level within a browsing site and not be negatively affected from and not need to be dewormed. That's the goal, and we are doing that with our herd, and there's lots of other people around the country that are doing the same thing.
Is there a breed of goat that's known to be more parasite resistant than other breeds?
Generally, the Kikos and the Spanish tend to be more parasite resistant. I've read that individuals in the myotonic breed are also parasite resistant. Some of the dairy breeds will have some natural parasite resistance in them, but the best way to produce a herd that has that is to do testing, have producers test their goats by doing fecal egg counts and fecal egg count reduction tests where they deworm a goat with a treatment and see if the treatment works 10 days after they've been dewormed, to assess if those goats are being affected by parasites, and then if the chemical dewormers still work in them, then selecting the individuals that don't need to be dewormed from your system and using those for breeding and producing the next generation, then again doing fecal egg counts and identifying the individuals that have low parasite counts and using those again for the next generation for breeding. That's the way any producer produces that kind of resistant animal in whatever breed they have. It doesn't matter what breed of goat they have. They can start selecting for parasite resistance by doing fecal egg counts. And it's a very powerful tool. The fastest way to do it is to buy goats that have natural parasite resistance and use those to breed across whatever breed of goat that people have. The other thing is having goats that are adapted to the environment that the producer lives in is the best way to ensure success in those animals. Moving a goat from a steamy, wet, southeastern United States area up to cold, dry North Dakota, windy type temperature, windy type conditions, the goat is going to struggle. Those goats are not going to survive and thrive as well in that kind of environment as they are in the one that they're adapted in. So getting animals that are local, where producers have selected for that parasite resistance, is the first and the fastest way to ensure that you have goats that will survive. And then the other thing to consider is how much grain are the people that are raising them feeding them. When we're working with our herd, we don't feed our does, our reproductive animals, any grain. We want goats that can produce offspring without grain inputs, just by using the brush that's available out there as their source of food and feeding them baleage and hay during the winter. And for producers that are feeding a lot of grain, those goats will need grain in order to maintain body condition because the producers are selecting for that by feeding grain. So those are, besides just the parasites, that's another consideration in terms of like what type of goat you would get. And regardless of breed, a goat from a farm where they've been selecting for parasite resistance will have more parasite resistance than a goat from a farm where they're just deworming everything on a rotation and or not actively selecting for genetics that are resistant to the parasites.
Okay. Now, do you run milk goats as well as the meat goats, or is it only meat?
We have both. We have a herd of around 15 dairy goats, and we don't milk them. We let them raise their babies, and they feed the milk that they produce to their offspring. We also have a meat goat herd, and we run them separately because dairy goats have been selected for generations to put all of their energy into producing milk and not maintaining their body condition. And the forage value of the woody vegetation, the brush out there, is not sufficiently energy dense for most breeds of dairy goats to lactate at that level and thrive and survive without grain inputs. So we feed grain to our dairy goats when they're in the brush or on pasture, but we do not feed grain to our meat goats that are in a separate group and in the exact same forage conditions and weather conditions because they metabolically don't need the grain. So you can do either one, and what we do is we breed our dairy goats to our meat goat bucks and select the kids from those crosses that are both parasite resistant and can grow well with less energy density in their diet than their mothers, than those dairy goats. And then we transition those kids into the meat herd and see how they perform. If they lose body condition, they get stuck back in the dairy herd, fed for the summer and sold because they don't meet our production goals. If they can perform without grain inputs in the meat goat herd, that's what we're looking for. So we keep those ones and use them for producing the next generation.
Okay. So, and by doing that, you might find that that you're looking for dairy goats that would be able to survive and do well on that kind of a situation where they're clearing brush and.
Yeah, what it produces are goats that are more dual purpose. They will have a greater milk production than your standard meat goat, but they will maintain their body condition better than your standard dairy goat. And so by selecting for that balance of traits, we move the goats out of the high input grain-fed group into the low-input meat type group, and they can feed their babies without any problem. They could be milked by, if somebody wanted to use them as a browsing herd that they also milk and make cheese and milk products and various other things out of, that would work too. I mean, you can milk any meat goat out there. They just aren't going to have the volume of milk that a dairy goat will have. It's just the same as milking a dairy cow versus a beef cow. The beef cow will have a higher components of protein and fat in their milk than the dairy cow, but the dairy cow will have a greater volume produced per lactation. And it's the same with the dairy goats versus the meat goats. Dairy goats tend to have much higher volume and lower components than the meat goats.
And how much milk could someone expect from a dairy goat each day, would you say?
Well, the goal for the big dairies is to have between 8 and 10 pounds of milk per doe per day. That is on a high input diet, very controlled conditions. The average for most dairy goats would be between 3 and 5 pounds per goat per day. And for meat goats, it would be probably closer between 2 and 3 pounds of milk per goat per day.
Okay. All right. So I was wondering, if you were going to try to raise goats, but also if you had a pasture where you wanted to grow some trees as well, what would you recommend for protecting those trees? Do the goats need to be totally fenced off from the trees, or would there be a way where you could still have them in the same paddock as that the goats are in?
It really depends on the species of tree and the age of the trees. So some trees have very thin bark that's easily stripped off of them when they're young, but as they get older, their bark gets more corky and thick and can't be stripped very easily. There are some trees that will develop that kind of bark when they're very young, like an oak tree can develop that kind of bark quite young. Walnut trees are pretty impervious to goats even when they're young and small. Things like apple trees, that the prunus species, they can be girdled quite old. I mean, quite large diameter trees will get girdled by goats if they aren't protected. the hawthorn group. Maples also tend to get girdled pretty easily, and that is the biggest way that once a tree is above the level that a goat can reach to defoliate all the leaves, the girdling is the effect that the goats can produce that can cause the most damage to those larger trees. So if you have a species of tree that you're trying to protect in an area where you're pushing goats to remove woody invasive species in the understory, then you need to protect them either with the trunks need to be covered either with chicken wire or placing essentially a cage around the trunk that prevents the goats from getting close enough that they can chew on the bark. Sometimes another thing that works is putting up a temporary, essentially a coil of electric wire on insulator posts around that tree while the goats are in that particular part of the paddock. And often the goats will be in there for 3 days to a week, and then they won't be in there again for another few months. So it doesn't need to be permanent protection, but you have the trade-off of, okay, putting up that exclusion once or putting it up multiple times within a season in a less permanent form. And there are you can get electronet pieces that are short and can just be set up quickly around a tree like that and run off of a solar-powered, battery-powered energizer at that location. And that's plenty good to keep the goats away from that tree. The sprays and like cayenne spray and various other things that are supposedly good for keeping animals away don't really work for goats. They will, if there's a species of tree that they like and they know what it is, they will ignore the cayenne pepper and just girdle the bark anyway. So you have to be very intentional about what you want to save and what you want to let the goats girdle. And then the other thing too is if you have an area that there's a large number of that kind of tree in that area, you can let them kill some of them and move the goats on before they cause significant damage to a large proportion of those trees. And it depends on, are you using those trees for producing wood in the future? Are they going to be used for fruit or nut production? If the goats cause damage to those trunks, is that going to be a problem for the value of whatever those trees are going to be used for in the future? So it's always balancing out what's the goal and what kind of management of the animals will achieve the goals that you have with those trees in that location and that property in that year.
Okay. So I was curious, so if someone wanted to raise goats and they were going to seed down a pasture some grasses and forbs and possibly even plant some trees for the goats to eat as well, do you know, like off the top of your head, are there any species that they really like, or any trees or anything that they really prefer over others?
Yeah, I mean they really like the kind of maple group of trees. The box elders are kind of candy plants. They like woody bramble type species, so roses and gooseberries and blackberries, black raspberries, those sorts of things. I'm trying to think of a species. I mean, really the things that they don't like. I mean, goats, the thing is, goats will just about eat every species of woody vegetation that's out there. And really the best thing for keeping them healthy is diversity and less about particular species. So having a diversity of forage types out there is ideal. And the forage plants that you would plant as a pasture that are grasses and legumes and broadleaves, those pretty much anything that grows well in the soil type and the climate that the producer is in is what that producer should plant in those areas, because the goats will eat that. And if it's in a good boot stage, high quality forage stage, when the animals are rotated through it, the goats will get lots of nutrition from that and do very well on that. And then having those woody species as extra forage to consume, and having a diversity of those woody species, which would be ideally species that are also adapted to whatever the local conditions are, planting those species and or species that you want as a producer to collect something from in terms of a product like nuts or fruits or fodder or wood for particular uses. Having those multiple uses and a diversity of forages are the best way to ensure the health of the animals, but then also diversify the income streams for that property.
So with goats, do they tend to have when they land, or whenever they have their kids, do they tend to have more than one at a time, or is it usually just one?
Yes. So the profitability of goats and sheep and the benefit of them over cattle and other species that tend to have a single offspring is that they do have twins, and sometimes they have triplets or quads. Goats and sheep only have 2 teats, so the ideal is for them to have 2 kids or 2 lambs every year, and they can feed both of those kids or both of those lambs at the same time. If they have 3 and they only have 2 teats, then one of them is not nursing while the mom is standing still to allow the nursing and the letdown of the milk. So having more than 2 kids or 2 lambs, whether that's goats or sheep, can be a problem if the producer doesn't want to bottle feed them. And the bottle feeding takes labor and time and extra management that is avoided by letting the does or ewes raise their own offspring. And so some does, some ewes will raise triplets, quads without any problem. They'll do it just fine. They have really good mothering ability, and others don't. And so there again, selection is important for identifying which individuals are good mothers and keeping those and selecting them for producing the next generation, and producing or selecting for does and ewes that can produce at least twins every breeding and not produce singles. It's common that a first-time maiden ewe or doe will have a single, and then the following year and all parturitions after that, they'll have twins or triplets. That's pretty common. But if by the second year, the second parity, that doe or that ewe is still producing singles and it's not a nutritional issue and that sort of thing, then for our production system, that's not a whole lot better than having a cow. So we cull those animals and we select and keep the ones that can produce twins and raise them without any intervention from us. And that produces more than the weight of the doe herself in raised offspring each year. And that's our goal with our production system. And it allows goats and sheep to be more profitable than beef just because they have two or more offspring every year, and they raise more than their own body weight in offspring every year.
Mm-hmm. And then as far as, so if someone was interested in getting into goats or sheep, as far as the marketing, is there a good market out there for direct marketing of sheep and goats to people for the meat?
Direct marketing for lamb is fairly good because the high-end restaurants are they have no problem selling lamb to people who are interested in fine dining. Goats don't fit into that category at this time. The primary consumers of goat are the ethnic communities, and they aren't going to pay high dollar for the animals in terms of certain cuts at a restaurant. They're going to buy either a whole animal or a half an animal, half a goat, and they're going to barbecue it, or they're going to roast it, or they're going to chop it up into cubes and mix it with curry. And it's more of a family level event and less of a going out to fine dining kind of event. So the majority of, from my experience, the majority of direct marketing in where I live is very time consuming, and you have to do a lot of bartering in order to get a price that is reflective of what we've spent in terms of producing the animal. And for us, it's a whole lot easier to load up 70 bucklings that we've produced during that year and take them to the local auction and get around $150 per head for them, paid by the buyer for the ethnic processing plant that is in Chicago or one that's up in the Twin Cities. So those buyers go around to all of the auctions that sell sheep and goats, and they bid for against other buyers that are there to buy the lots of goats and sheep that go through. And for us, it's very low time spent with marketing. Yeah, we don't get the highest price, but we get our costs covered and make income at that sale price. So we could probably sell it for more individually, but we would spend a whole lot of our time doing it. And the people that generally want to buy them want to slaughter them on the farm, and that's illegal in Wisconsin. And then we would have to do something with the offal that's produced and provide water and electric and all that sort of thing at the place where the people want to process it, and we just don't have the facilities for that. Nor do we have the time to stand there and supervise while one or two people process one or two goats over an hour's period of time. It just is not financially and time-wise feasible for us to do something like that. So for us, the direct marketing is not a viable business option right now. If it was legal to process and sell meat from our own farm, then we could do something like that. But as the rules are in Wisconsin right now, we can't, and we can make a whole lot more money with a whole lot less effort by just taking them to auction and selling them essentially wholesale to people that will buy them in large groups and process them at low cost for the ethnic consumers. If we were to sell them, if we had freezer space and cared to process them ourselves and then sell cuts like most people do with beef or pork, we could try and do that. The problem is most American consumers, most Caucasian consumers don't buy goat. They don't know what to do with goat. And so trying to get a return of $150 per head for the goat after paying between $90 and $125 for processing, which is what most processors charge per goat regardless of the size of the goat, makes us need to charge between $9 and $16 a pound for that goat meat. Most people won't pay that. It's very hard to sell goat meat by the cut at that price. So there again, the direct marketing is a royal pain. We just don't have an easy way to do that, and the processors end up charging almost as much as the value of the animal is itself. And the processors that process for the ethnic communities charge $12 a head for processing because they're doing huge numbers in a slaughter plant in Chicago or in the Twin Cities. And they're doing it halal slaughter, and it's a very efficient process with large numbers going through every day. And the small local processors can't provide that cheap of a processing. And so in the end, then the farmer has to sell that meat at a higher price in order to get the same value out of the animal as they would by just taking it to auction and selling it to the ethnic community that processes them in Chicago. So there's all these different trade-offs and considerations, and for us, it's just easier to take them to auction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. It sounds like it makes a lot of sense to do it that way.
And I mean, maybe things will change in the future, but for now, that's just kind of the way that we've found works best.
Yeah. Yeah, this has been really good. I really appreciate your time and everything.
Sure.
Yeah, I guess to end, I was just wondering if you have any advice to beginners who might be interested in getting started with goats.
Sure. I mean, I'm very willing to send out the presentations I've put together on business operations focused on goats. I teach the UW short course, teach a few classes on goat and sheep production, and those short course classes are a good source of information for anybody who's considering a grass-based or forage-based production system. There's an entire class or a degree focus for that. There's also training available at Southwest Tech for dairy goat production, but they're bringing in more meat goat instructors to teach more information about meat goats. And then specific to using goats for brush control, learning the native vegetation and the invasive vegetation that is common in whatever environment the person lives in, and how those goats prefer to consume that type of vegetation, and how to use those goats for removal of that vegetation is essentially ecology, studying ecology and forages, and looking at animal preferences and animal behavior. And so combining those two things is what any person that is interested in like a goat-based browsing business or browsing service type business should familiarize themselves with, because they're going to need to meet the expectations of the landowner in terms of controlling the brush, but also maintain the health of their animals so that they reproduce and produce a larger herd the following year, have offspring to sell, that sort of thing, and essentially keep people happy too with seeing healthy goats at the browsing site, because it tends to be a spectator sport when the goats are out on jobs in residential areas where there's people that know that they're there. They'll just stand outside the fence and watch the goats. So it's important to maintain and manage them in a way that they are healthy and in good body condition and happy and not limping, not lame. They'll get along in the herd well, and then managing them to achieve the objectives of the landowner in terms of control of whatever the species is that's the problem on that person's land.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sounds good. So, yeah, I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Nice talking with you tonight. So, and what's the best way for someone to get a hold of you if they have any
So
more
probably,
questions?
yeah, for me, email is probably the easiest, or phone. And my email at UW is canolden@wisc.edu, Cherrie A. Nolden. And phone number is 608-477-1981.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Have a good night. Enjoy your
Thank you.
Thanksgiving.
Thanks, you too.
Okay. Bye.
Bye-bye.